When I first discovered the property, it felt like finding a secret paradise hidden just 2 hours from the city. The listing mentioned a natural creek running along the eastern boundary, but nothing prepared me for the gentle sound of flowing water that greeted me during that first viewing. The real estate agent spoke about square footage and recent renovations, but all I could think about was finally having enough space for the extensive garden I had dreamed of for decades. The creek has consistent flow year-round, the agent explained, flipping through property documents. The original survey confirms riparian water rights came with the deed. That means you have legal access to reasonable water use from the creek for your property. I nodded, already imagining the irrigation system I would install. After 30 years in a city apartment with nothing but potted plants on a fire escape, this land represented freedom. The freedom to grow, to build, to create something truly mine. The neighborhood seemed perfect too. Pristine homes with manicured yards lined the streets leading to my more natural, slightly wild 5 acres. During the inspection, several neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves. They brought cookies, casseroles, and seemingly genuine smiles. "Just be careful with any exterior changes," one neighbor whispered as she was leaving. "The Lakeside Estates HOA is quite particular." She glanced over her shoulder before adding, "Patricia runs a tight ship." I dismissed the warning. The HOA paperwork seemed standard, regulations about house colors, fence heights, and lawn maintenance. Nothing that would interfere with my plans for a natural garden oasis. My property sat at the edge of the development, partially bordered by protected woodland. The creek entered through those woods, curved along my eastern boundary, then continued through several HOA common areas before exiting toward the lake. I signed the papers on a bright Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, I had moved in my essential belongings. By Saturday, I had purchased supplies for a modest drip irrigation system that would draw water from the creek to nurture my future garden. The first 6 months passed in blissful productivity. I installed raised beds for vegetables, planted native flowering shrubs, and created a stone path that wound through what was becoming a showcase of regional botany. Neighbors walking by would stop to compliment my efforts. Some even asked for gardening advice. The first hint of trouble came not from the HOA, but from nature itself. Weather reports began warning of drought conditions developing across the region. Rainfall had been below average for months, and reservoirs were dropping to concerning levels. This could be the beginning of a multi-year drought cycle, the meteorologist explained during the evening news as I unpacked my kitchen. County officials are already discussing potential water restrictions if conditions worsen. I felt fortunate to have the creek, which continued flowing steadily despite the dry conditions. Following all proper procedures, I installed a small pump and filtration system, carefully designed to take only what my garden needed while leaving the vast majority of water in the creek. The system was a masterpiece of efficiency, delivering targeted moisture directly to plant roots with minimal waste. As spring turned to summer, I would wake early each morning to tend my flourishing garden. The creek bubbled peacefully as birds sang in the trees overhead. Dragonflies hovered above the water while butterflies danced among my flowers. It was exactly the sanctuary I had envisioned, my own piece of paradise earned after decades of hard work. I had no idea that paradise was about to be lost. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, disrupting my morning coffee ritual on the back deck. The HOA logo was printed prominently in the corner, a stylized image of a lake surrounded by perfectly uniform houses. I opened it with mild curiosity that quickly transformed into disbelief. "Dear homeowner," it began, It has come to our attention that unauthorized water collection and irrigation systems have been installed on your property without proper HOA review and approval. Section 8.3 of the Lakeside Estates Covenant explicitly prohibits any exterior water feature or irrigation system not approved by the Architectural Review Committee. I read the letter twice, then set it aside to finish my coffee. Surely this was a misunderstanding. The creek water usage had been clearly outlined in my property documents. The irrigation system was entirely on my property and used only water I had legal rights to access. That afternoon, I pulled out all my closing documents, property surveys, and water rights certificates. I spent hours reviewing every detail, confirming what I already knew. My riparian water rights were explicitly included in the deed. The County Water Authority had even provided documentation acknowledging these rights when I registered my small pump. I called my neighbor Thomas, who had lived in the community for over a decade. "Oh, you got on Patricia's radar," he said with a grimace I could hear through the phone. "Patricia Harrington has been HOA president for 9 years running, former corporate lawyer, treats the HOA like her personal kingdom." "But I have legal water rights," I explained. "It is documented in my deed." "Does not matter to Patricia," Thomas replied. "She believes the HOA covenant supersedes individual property rights. Last year, she forced the Millers to remove a 20-year-old oak tree because it dropped too many leaves into her yard." The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following evening. I arrived early, a folder of documents tucked under my arm. The meeting room at the community center was arranged with precision, rows of chairs facing a raised platform where 5 board members sat behind a long table. Patricia Harrington sat center, a woman in her 60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. When the floor opened for homeowner concerns, I approached the microphone and explained my situation calmly, presenting my documentation of water rights. "As you can see," I concluded, "my irrigation system is fully compliant with both county regulations and the property deed." Patricia glanced at my documents without actually touching them. The HOA covenant clearly states that all water features and irrigation systems must receive prior approval. You failed to submit proper documentation before installation. "But my water rights predated the HOA formation," I countered. "The creek access was established with the original property division in 1973. "That may be," Patricia replied, her voice clipped. "But when you purchased in Lakeside Estates, you agreed to abide by our covenant. The board will review your situation and provide written response." As I returned to my seat, I noticed several neighbors avoiding eye contact. One mouthed, "Sorry," when Patricia turned away. The rest of the meeting continued with discussions about repainting the community mailboxes and approving new seasonal flowers for the entrance. 2 days later, a second letter arrived, this one more formal than the first. It cited 3 different covenant sections allegedly violated by my irrigation system and demanded immediate removal, threatening daily fines if I failed to comply within 10 days. That same evening, the county issued its first official drought declaration. New restrictions limited lawn watering to once weekly for residential properties. Yet as I drove home from work the next day, I noticed sprinklers running throughout the HOA common areas. The community center's expansive lawn, the decorative median strips, and the neighborhood entrance all glistened with moisture despite the restrictions. The final letter arrived by certified mail. It was no longer just about the irrigation system. Now they claimed my excessive water usage was redirecting community resources and undermining neighborhood aesthetic standards. The letter ended with a clear threat: comply within 72 hours or face fines of $100 per day plus potential property liens. That night, I watched the local news report on the worsening drought. Reservoirs had dropped to 63% capacity. The weatherman pointed to charts showing rainfall at historic lows. Meanwhile, through my window, I could see my neighbor's sprinklers activating across the street, water arcing gracefully in the moonlight over a perfect lawn. The injustice burned in my chest. I had followed every rule, respected every regulation, while Patricia and her board operated as if the drought and the law did not apply to them. Little did I know how much worse things would get. I had been at work for 10 hours that Thursday, a particularly grueling day of back-to-back meetings. All I wanted was to spend the evening tending to my garden, feeling the soil between my fingers as the stress of corporate life melted away. Instead, I arrived home to devastation. From the driveway, I could already tell something was wrong. The vibrant colors that normally greeted me looked dull, faded. I rushed from my car to the garden beds where my prized heirloom tomatoes had been thriving just that morning. Now they hung limply on their supports, leaves curled and wilting. "No, no, no," I whispered, kneeling to touch the soil. Bone dry, impossible. The irrigation system had been functioning perfectly for months. I followed the main line from the creek to the distribution hub, checking connections and looking for blockages. When I reached the intake at the creek bank, I found the source of the problem. The primary supply pipe had been cut clean through, not broken or cracked by natural causes, but deliberately severed with what must have been pipe cutters or a saw. Both ends showed precise, straight cuts. Heat rushed to my face as I stood there, holding the disconnected pieces of my irrigation system. Nearly $3,000 in plants were dying before my eyes. Years of careful cultivation and planning withered in the summer heat. This was not an accident or coincidence. This was sabotage. I grabbed my phone and took dozens of photos: the cut pipe, the dying plants, the precise nature of the damage. Then I called the police to report the vandalism and trespassing. Officer Reynolds arrived 40 minutes later, walking the property line with me and examining the damage. "This is definitely intentional," he confirmed, making notes in his report. "Any idea who might have done this?" I hesitated only briefly before mentioning the HOA dispute. The officer nodded knowingly. "We get a lot of calls about HOA issues, but property damage crosses a line. I will file this report, but honestly, proving who did it might be difficult." As Officer Reynolds was leaving, a maintenance truck with the Lakeside Estates logo pulled up to service the community flower beds across the street. I approached the two workers, who had been employed by the HOA for years. "Did you see anyone near my property today?" I asked casually. "Someone vandalized my irrigation system." The younger worker glanced nervously at his colleague before looking down at his boots. The older man sighed. "Look, we do not want any trouble," he said quietly. "We were told to perform inspection and necessary maintenance on the creek bed this morning. Patricia gave specific instructions about removing unauthorized equipment that was impeding water flow to community areas." "You cut my water line?" I asked, my voice rising despite my effort to stay calm. "We were following orders," the younger man said, still not meeting my eyes. "Patricia said it was illegal equipment and had to be removed immediately." I thanked them for their honesty and walked back to my property, fury building with each step. This was not just bureaucratic bullying anymore. This was destruction of private property, trespassing, potentially thousands in damages. Inside my home, I set up emergency measures, filling every container I owned with water to hand irrigate the most valuable plants. I worked until past midnight, prioritizing which areas to save with the limited water I could transport from the creek by hand. My back ached and my hands blistered from carrying heavy buckets up and down the slope. The next morning, I photographed every wilting plant, documenting the extent of the damage. I estimated the losses: 3 years of work, thousands in plants, hundreds of hours of labor, all threatened because of one woman's power trip. With trembling hands, I drafted a certified letter to the HOA board. In calm, measured language, I outlined the facts: my legal water rights, the documented vandalism, the maintenance crew's admission, and the significant damages incurred. I requested immediate acknowledgement of wrongdoing, compensation for damages, and written permission to reinstall my irrigation system. I have filed police reports for trespassing and property damage, I wrote in closing. I would prefer to resolve this matter directly with the board rather than pursuing legal remedies, but I will not hesitate to protect my property rights if necessary. While waiting at the post office to send the certified letter, I overheard 2 women discussing their water bills. "It is ridiculous," one said. "The county is charging drought surcharges while the HOA forces us to maintain golf course lawns or face fines." "Patricia's lawn looks perfect as always," the other replied. "Did you notice the community center grass is still emerald green despite the water restrictions?" I looked out the post office window at the community center across the street. Despite county regulations strictly limiting watering to once weekly before 9 a.m., the sprinklers were running at full force. The contrast was striking. The HOA common areas remained lush and green while my legal garden withered. That evening, I drove slowly through the neighborhood, documenting sprinklers running outside permitted hours, measuring the vibrant green of lawns that should have shown at least some signs of drought stress. I noted which homes belonged to board members, all remarkably well-watered despite restrictions. As I pulled into my driveway, Patricia's luxury SUV cruised past my house, slowing as she surveyed my struggling garden with what looked like satisfaction on her face. She did not wave or acknowledge me. She simply drove on, probably heading home to her perfectly manicured yard that somehow remained untouched by the drought affecting everyone else. That night, as I hand-watered the plants I could still save, I made a decision. Playing by their rules had failed. Being reasonable had failed. It was time to use the law and nature itself to fight back. The law office of Meridian Legal Services occupied a modest building downtown. Inside, attorney Sarah Chen reviewed my documents with careful attention, occasionally making notes or highlighting sections. I had brought everything: property deeds, water rights documentation, HOA correspondence, photos of the damage, and the police report. "You have very clear riparian water rights," Sarah confirmed after examining the documents. "These rights are attached to your property because the creek physically touches your land. These rights generally cannot be superseded by HOA covenants unless you specifically sign them away." She pulled a thick legal textbook from her shelf and opened to a section about water law. Riparian doctrine allows reasonable use of water flowing through or adjacent to your property. Reasonable use is generally defined as usage that does not significantly impair the rights of other riparian owners. The HOA common areas downstream also touch the creek, I pointed out. Does that give them equal rights? Yes, they also have riparian rights, Sarah acknowledged. But that does not give them the right to trespass on your property or damage your equipment, and it certainly does not allow them to monopolize the water source during a drought. Sarah recommended sending a formal legal notice demanding compensation for damages and recognition of my water rights. She drafted the letter that afternoon, citing relevant water law statutes and property rights precedents. "This should get their attention," she said as I signed the letter. "Most HOA boards will back down when confronted with solid legal arguments. They rely on homeowners not knowing their rights or being unwilling to fight." I left her office feeling cautiously optimistic. Surely, a legal letter would force the board to negotiate reasonably. I was wrong. Days passed with no response from the HOA. I called the management company 3 times, leaving increasingly urgent messages. Emails to the board went unanswered. When I attempted to speak with Patricia directly after spotting her at the community mailboxes, she quickly got into her car, claiming she was late for an appointment. Meanwhile, I discovered something troubling. The County Water Authority website had posted all drought violation notices as public record. Lakeside Estates HOA had received 4 citations for excessive water usage and violating restricted watering hours, all while threatening residents about conservation. The county scheduled an emergency drought meeting at the town hall. Residents packed the auditorium as officials explained the worsening conditions and stricter upcoming measures. From my seat near the back, I watched Patricia approach the microphone during public comments. "Lakeside Estates understands the severity of the drought," she began, her voice practiced and confident. "However, we must balance conservation with maintaining community standards. Our property values depend on aesthetic appeal, which requires reasonable irrigation allowances." The water commissioner looked unimpressed. "All communities must comply with restrictions, Mrs. Harrington. Aesthetic concerns do not override public resource management during a crisis." "Perhaps Lakeside Estates could receive a limited exemption," Patricia suggested smoothly. "Our community contributes significantly to the county tax base. Surely some accommodation could be arranged." My blood boiled as I listened to her attempting to secure special treatment. When the meeting ended, I lingered in the parking lot, where I noticed several other lakeside homeowners gathered in a small group. "Did you hear her trying to get exemptions?" one man asked. "Meanwhile, she fined me $200 last month because my grass was too brown. She threatened to put a lien on the Johnsons' house when they installed drought-resistant landscaping without approval," another added. I introduced myself and mentioned my situation. Their expressions shifted from surprise to outrage as I described the cut water line. "That is illegal," a woman named Corinne said. "They cannot destroy private property regardless of what the covenant says." They cited the Davidsons last year for using soaker hoses instead of sprinklers, another neighbor named Michael added, "even though soaker hoses use less water." We exchanged phone numbers, forming an impromptu alliance of frustrated homeowners. It was comforting to know I was not alone in my struggles with the HOA regime. The final response from the HOA arrived a week later, not to my legal letter, which they completely ignored, but as a formal notice of violation. They had increased the daily fine to $250 and added a new threat. Failure to comply may result in the HOA board exercising its right to enter the property and remove non-compliant equipment at owner's expense. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the violation notice in one hand and my property survey in the other. The creek burbled outside my window, taunting me with its proximity yet inaccessibility. My garden continued to deteriorate despite my exhausting daily routine of hand watering. The HOA had made their position clear. They would not negotiate, would not acknowledge my rights, would not even respond to legal correspondence. They believed their power was absolute. The question now was what I could legally do to protect my property without surrendering my rights. As I studied the property survey, I noticed something I had overlooked before. The creek entered my property from the northeast corner, flowed along my eastern boundary, then continued southwest through HOA common areas. The survey clearly marked the creek bed as a natural watercourse subject to seasonal variation. Seasonal variation. The phrase sparked an idea, one that would require research, planning, and perfect execution. I picked up my phone and called the one person I knew who might help make it happen. Technically speaking, it is completely legal, Mark said, tracing his finger along the topographical map spread across my dining table. As an environmental engineer specializing in watershed management, Mark understood both the science and regulations governing natural watercourses. The key is understanding riparian doctrine, he continued. You have the right to reasonable use of water flowing through your property, but you also have certain rights regarding the watercourse itself, specifically when it comes to protecting your land from erosion or managing flow within your property boundaries. I had known Mark since college. When I called explaining my situation, he drove 2 hours to see the property firsthand. Now we sat surrounded by maps, watershed surveys, and legal documents as night fell outside. So I can modify the creek bed on my property, I asked, wanting absolute clarity. Within limits, Mark confirmed. You cannot dam the creek entirely or prevent reasonable downstream flow, but you can make modifications for legitimate purposes like erosion control, habitat improvement, or more efficient water distribution within your property boundaries. He pulled out a red marker and began drawing on the map overlay. See this natural depression in your northeastern section. Water naturally wants to follow the path of least resistance. With some strategic grading here, he circled an area, and reinforcement there, another circle, you could create a secondary channel that diverts a portion of the flow deeper into your property before rejoining the main creek bed at your southern boundary. Would that be enough to impact the downstream flow? I asked. By itself, probably not significantly, Mark admitted. But combine it with wider pools in these sections to increase water retention and evaporation on your property, plus strategic planting of thirsty native vegetation along the new route, and you could legally reduce downstream flow by perhaps 30 to 40% during drought conditions, all while demonstrating legitimate land management purposes. We worked late into the night, refining the plan. Mark calculated optimal depths for the new channel sections, identified key points where natural-looking stone placements could slow water velocity, and selected native plant species that would both stabilize the new creek sections and utilize significant water. The beauty of this approach, Mark explained as he finalized the drawings, is that it appears completely natural when finished. No concrete, no obvious human engineering, just subtle reshaping that works with the land contours. The next day, I began my research in earnest. I spent hours at the county records office, reviewing watershed regulations and riparian rights documentation. I studied successful creek restoration projects and familiarized myself with native riparian plant species. Every free moment went into understanding the legal and environmental aspects of my plan. Equipment and materials were the next challenge. I needed tools and supplies that would not attract attention. Over the course of 2 weeks, I made purchases from different stores across the county, a shovel from one hardware store, landscape fabric from another, river rocks from a garden center 30 miles away. I paid cash for everything, never buying enough at once to raise suspicion. Late one evening, Thomas called, Patricia has been asking questions about you, he warned. She drove by your house twice today. Thanks for the heads up, I replied. Any idea what she is planning? The board called an executive session yesterday, Thomas said. I could not attend, but Margaret from down the street said they discussed escalating enforcement for covenant violations. This news accelerated my timeline. I needed allies, people I could trust who shared my frustration with the HOA regime. I carefully approached several neighbors who had expressed similar concerns at the Drought meeting. Michael, who had received violations for his rainfall collection barrels, was the first to offer help. Corinne and her husband David, who had fought the HOA over solar panel installation, quickly joined our cause. By the end of the week, I had 5 committed neighbors, all homeowners who had experienced the board's overreach firsthand. We gathered in my basement on a Saturday evening, reviewing the plan by flashlight rather than turning on the main lights. Mark had returned to walk everyone through their roles. We will work in stages, I explained. Small, gradual changes that will not attract attention. Each modification must look natural, as if created by normal erosion and water flow patterns. Michael, who had landscaping experience, suggested starting at the property entry point. If we create a small stone spread there, it will naturally slow the water and create a wider entry pool. Nothing suspicious about placing decorative stones along a creek bank. Corinne proposed planting schedules. We should add riparian plants in phases. First the smaller species, then gradually introducing the larger, thirstier varieties as the channel establishes. We agreed to begin work the following weekend, starting before dawn and working in short shifts to avoid attracting attention. Each person took responsibility for different aspects, Michael for the stone placement, David for the subtle grading work, Corinne for plant selection and installation. The first morning of implementation arrived with perfect conditions, a light fog that provided additional cover as we began the initial work. We started with the most natural-looking modifications, strategic stone placement at the creek entry point and subtle bank reshaping to encourage water to flow into the natural depression Mark had identified. By mid-morning, we had completed the first phase, which looked remarkably like natural creek features, nothing that would raise suspicion from casual observation. We scattered leaf litter and branches over our work areas to disguise any signs of recent activity. The process continued over 3 weekends. Each session brought subtle but meaningful changes to the creek's flow pattern. We created wider pooling areas that increased surface evaporation and allowed more water to seep into my property's soil. We installed native water-loving plants along the new secondary channel, their roots designed to absorb significant moisture while stabilizing the banks. Throughout the process, we maintained meticulous attention to property boundaries. Every modification occurred exclusively on my land. Every change had legitimate erosion control or habitat improvement purposes that I carefully documented with before and after photographs. The final phase involved the most critical component, the subtle junction where a portion of the creek would follow the new channel deeper into my property before eventually rejoining the main creek bed. This required our most precise work, creating a natural-looking split that would be indistinguishable from normal stream branching. When we finished, nothing looked engineered or artificial. The creek still flowed, no damming, no blocking, but now it meandered more extensively through my property, feeding my garden through natural seepage while reducing downstream flow to the HOA common areas by an estimated 30%. Standing at my property line that final evening, watching the water flow along its new course, I felt a profound satisfaction. I had not broken any laws. I had not violated any regulations. I had simply exercised my legitimate property rights to manage the natural resources within my boundaries, just as the HOA had claimed the right to manage theirs. The water still flowed downstream, just not quite as abundantly as before. Nature works on its own schedule. The changes to the creek flow did not produce immediate dramatic results. Instead, the effects emerged gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, like the slow shifting of seasons. 2 weeks after completing our modifications, I noticed the first signs of change. The decorative pond at the community center entrance, normally a vibrant water feature with dancing fountains, appeared slightly lower than usual. The fountains still ran, but with visibly reduced pressure. By the 3rd week, more noticeable changes appeared in the HOA common areas. The meticulously maintained flower beds along the main boulevard showed subtle signs of stress. Nothing dramatic, just slight wilting that most residents probably would not notice, but that my experienced gardener's eye immediately recognized. I maintained my normal routine, working in my garden, which was slowly recovering thanks to the increased groundwater seepage from the modified creek flow. When neighbors passed by, I would chat casually about the drought and the challenges of keeping plants alive during water restrictions. The first official acknowledgement came during week 4. An emergency HOA email blast went out to all residents. Due to worsening drought conditions, the board has identified reduced water flow in community water features. Conservation measures are being implemented in common areas. All residents are reminded to adhere strictly to county water restrictions. Patricia called an emergency HOA meeting the following evening. I attended, sitting quietly in the back row as she addressed the gathered homeowners with barely concealed panic. "The reduced creek flow is affecting our community aesthetic," she declared, packing in front of the board table. "Our landscaping service reports significant stress to plantings throughout common areas. The board is investigating potential upstream interference with our water supply." A neighbor raised his hand. "Why are the common areas still being watered outside restricted hours? I received a violation for watering my vegetable garden on Tuesday, but the sprinklers were running at the clubhouse yesterday afternoon." Patricia bristled. Community areas have different requirements than individual properties. The board has discretion to maintain essential community assets as needed. Another homeowner stood up. "My water bill shows a drought surcharge this month, but the HOA is ignoring the same restrictions they fine us for breaking." The meeting devolved into heated exchanges as more residents questioned the double standard. I remained silent, observing the growing discord. The seeds of discontent had been planted long before my creek modifications. I had simply created conditions where they could fully bloom. The following day, an anonymous report was filed with the County Water Authority regarding potential water restriction violations throughout Lakeside Estates common areas. I knew nothing about this report until 3 county water inspectors arrived at the community center the next morning, taking photographs and measurements of sprinkler systems and water features. Local news caught wind of the story. A van from Channel 8 parked outside the community entrance the following day, the reporter doing a live segment about luxury communities seeking exemptions from drought restrictions, while ordinary citizens face surcharges and fines. The camera panned across the contrast, the increasingly brown county park across the street versus the still green HOA entrance landscaping. The reporter pointed out the functioning fountains and asked pointed questions about water usage during a critical drought. Patricia attempted damage control, scheduling interviews and releasing statements about the HOA's commitment to environmental stewardship. But the evidence was visible to anyone driving through. While surrounding areas showed appropriate signs of drought conditions, Lakeside Estate's common areas remained suspiciously vibrant. I was pulling weeds in my front garden when Patricia's luxury SUV stopped at my curb one afternoon. She stepped out, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, leather portfolio clutched in her manicured hand. "We need to inspect your property," she announced without greeting. "The board has reason to believe you have made unauthorized modifications affecting community water resources." I straightened slowly, wiping my hands on my gardening apron. "Do you have a legal warrant for this inspection?" Her eyes narrowed. "The HOA covenant gives the board right of access for compliance inspections. My attorney advises that such access requires proper notice and cannot extend to areas not covered by HOA jurisdiction," I replied calmly. "The creek bed and riparian zones fall under county watershed management, not HOA authority." Patricia's face flushed with anger. "We will pursue all available remedies if you continue this obstruction." "As will I responded evenly, "including my pending complaints regarding trespassing, property damage, and selective enforcement of water restrictions." She returned to her vehicle without another word, tires squealing slightly as she accelerated away. The next day, official-looking vehicles parked at the community center, county drought enforcement officers conducting a comprehensive inspection. They examined irrigation systems, reviewed water usage records, and took extensive photographs. By afternoon, bright orange violation notices appeared on the community center doors and at various common area access points. The violations became public record: excessive water usage during restricted hours, failure to implement mandated drought measures, multiple previous warnings ignored. The fines totaled thousands of dollars, with daily penalties accumulating until compliance was achieved. Neighborhood opinion began shifting visibly. Where Patricia and the board once enjoyed unquestioned authority, residents now openly questioned their decisions and priorities. The divide grew between board loyalists and those increasingly critical of their management. At the monthly billing cycle, all residents received notices of a special assessment for drought-related community maintenance expenses. The assessment, $350 per household, sparked immediate outrage among homeowners already struggling with rising water bills and surcharges. An informal gathering formed in the park that weekend. Over 30 homeowners discussed the assessment, the violations, and the board's handling of the drought crisis. Michael distributed information about HOA board election procedures. Karen shared legal resources regarding challenging improper assessments. I participated quietly, sharing only factual information when asked directly. The momentum was building naturally now, requiring no push from me. Justice works similarly to water. Once you create the right conditions, it finds its own path forward. The emergency board election was scheduled following a petition signed by over 60% of Lakeside Estate's homeowners. The community center meeting room could barely contain the crowd that arrived to vote. People stood along walls and spilled into the hallway, determined to participate in this unprecedented recall election. Patricia sat stiffly at the board table, face impassive as homeowners one after another approached the microphone to express concerns about water management, selective enforcement, and financial transparency. The county water authority fines, now exceeding $15,000, had become the catalyst for widespread outrage. When votes were tallied, the results were decisive. Patricia and 3 board members were removed. The new board, led by Michael as president and Corinne as vice president, took their positions immediately. Their first official act was to suspend all outstanding violation notices related to drought measures pending comprehensive review. I sat quietly in the back corner, neither celebrating nor commenting. This had never been about personal victory. It was about restoring balance and fairness to our community. The following week, the new board invited me to meet with them and their newly retained attorney. In the community center conference room, Michael slid a document across the table. "This is a formal acknowledgement of water rights violations against your property," he explained. "The board recognizes that your riparian water rights were improperly infringed upon, and that property damage occurred without legal justification." The document included not only an apology, but also compensation for damaged plants and irrigation equipment. More importantly, it explicitly recognized my legal rights to the creek water that flowed through my property. "We would also like your input," Corinne added, unfolding a large landscaping plan. "The county is requiring us to implement drought-appropriate landscaping throughout common areas. Your expertise would be valuable in creating a sustainable plan." The proposal represented exactly what I had hoped for, not victory over my neighbors, but collaboration toward a better community. I agreed to help design native plant installations that would require minimal irrigation while maintaining aesthetic appeal. Over the following months, transformation came to Lakeside Estates. The formal, water-intensive landscaping gave way to beautiful native plant arrangements. Rain gardens appeared in common areas, designed to capture and utilize natural precipitation.